because Andrew's going to have the bulk of the responsibility here. This is going to be a reviewable play, so I'm going to send these around for review afterwards. And I also send it out a PowerPoint, an article, and I got a couple other things that I'm going to send down. But thank you for all being here for our training today. We're pleased that OF has asked us to present this 96-hour tool. It was developed last year as a deliverable. A lot of people had their hand in that, so thanks to those folks. And a special thanks to Scott and Shannon, because we've been beating on them for the last several weeks putting this together. They've been a lot of help, provided us a lot of feedback. And Shannon's going to help us with the presentation. She has some actual real-time data from all the units she put into the tool. Real time. Takes time. So yeah, the training is not 96 hours. It's only a couple hours, maybe 3. But hopefully we'll have some fun and make this a sort of an interactive dialogue, because there may be some slight tweaks or changes that we need to make. And then once we've completed this session, we're going to go ahead and email out all these materials to you. This article is much easier to read online, so we'll send that out to you. It's difficult to read here, but this is sort of a nuts and bolts of the process. So I guess I'll turn it over to Andrew at this point, and we'll keep going.
Good morning. This is the first time that we've actually presented this training. So with all things, feedback will make for improvement. We specifically did not send you out the tool and the chart and the material so that we could take some of your feedback, build it into the instruction process. If there's things that we can make more clear, explain better, we want to incorporate that before we give you the documents. So to our next slide, the training objective here today for the RRCs. Hopefully you'll leave with the ability to train hospitals to successfully complete the 96-hour sustainability assessment chart using the tool that we present pursuant to your deliverable number 1 for the year. Now the training objectives for you as you present it to the hospitals would be for the hospitals to understand how to use these resources in assessing their 96-hour sustainability, and that they would have the ability to complete the 96-hour sustainability assessment chart pursuant to hospital deliverable number 4 and be reimbursed $5,000. Some of the things that we'll go through here today, and we've got quite a few slides, many of which we can move through very quickly, but we include, just to give you the background, you can decide as you present this what material you think is most important to present and how much time you want to spend with it. We'll go over the project history, how the resources were developed. We'll talk about the documents themselves. Present you with some assumptions and some concepts that you need to understand and that hospitals need to understand in using this. Then we'll go through the process of determining sustainability, the steps that are part of this, how to use the tool, and how to use the assessment chart. By way of background, in 2010, Iroquois and Haney's, we inherited this project from the Finger Lakes RRC.
Good job.
Ann says she doesn't even remember, but
No, oh, I think so. That was excellent.
we
yeah.
wouldn't have gotten here without everything that they handed off to us. They had done a lot of research, collecting available resources, matrices, tools that have been used throughout the country to help hospitals with sustainability planning. So we took those resources, we continue to search for best practices, work through our hospital association colleagues in other states, trying to identify potential resources. I really kind of thought we'd come up with some kind of best practice out there. and we really weren't able to hit on something that we could just fully take and pass along. So we created a work group which was made up of Scott and Shannon, Mike Cahoon, Jared Shapiro, and Mary Jane Milano, who was with the Rochester Hospital Association and served as continuity from that Finger Lakes work group. And we set out to examine the tools and the matrices that we had collected. We selected two existing resources to work with. And we chose these two that we've modified, primarily because they've been recognized by the Joint Commission. They've been used in various formats for surveys, and probably most importantly, they're scalable and they're fairly user-friendly. The 96-hour sustainability tool that we present to you, we adapted this for use here from an ASHE. ASHE created this, developed this. It was originally titled A Process for Determining Resource and Asset Sustainability During Emergencies. And the process that goes into use of this tool is outlined in this article that Chris referenced and we send out electronically, provides a very good understanding of that process. The chart, this I have seen in a number of formats, in a number of places. I have seen hospitals use this for versions of this chart for Joint Commission surveys. I've seen it circulated around by consultants. The version that we have adapted came from one that was used by Mercy Health Partners in Cincinnati. So none of these resources are entirely new. We didn't create them. We've modified them and adapted them. So we've got two primary documents that we're going to give to you to train the hospitals on. The tool and the chart. The sustainability assessment chart, which is right here, it's a visual representation and analysis of your sustainability periods and the gaps that you have and how they might impact operations. The chart's color-coded, as we'll show you. The tool is an Excel document that will calculate the number of hours that your resources and assets will last. And those calculations are based on census and inventory data. The couple of concepts, assumptions that are important to understand from the outset. We have pre-populated both the chart and the tool with resources and assets. We've also categorized those by critical function, Joint Commission critical function. These are meant to be modified by hospitals based on what is essential to their emergency operations. They're meant to be detailed, expanded on, for instance, housekeeping supplies. You know, if a hospital wants to detail what those housekeeping supplies are, they can do that. If they think for any reason that any of the items here are not essential to their emergency operations or don't apply, they can delete it. They can add on. So both the tool and the chart are meant to be modified, meant to be used as the hospital deems most appropriate. The chart and the tool will tell hospitals how long something will last. The tool and chart are not meant in any way to tell you what to do if you run out of something. The hospital needs to look internally to their plans for their mitigation strategies. We recommend that a multidisciplinary process be used in determining the essential resources, in making the calculations using the tool, and in determining, making reasonable assumptions that need to go into the decision-making process. We use the term emergency management committee kind of in a generic sense here, but we recommend that this process is deliverable, be conducted through the emergency management committee. So a hospital needs a process for determining sustainability, how long they can continue to provide care, how long their resources and assets will last. And going to the next slide, here's a kind of simplified chart that visualizes the process that we're offering here for use of this tool and chart. The first step would be for the Emergency Management Committee to determine the list of resources and assets that are essential to the hospital's emergency operations. The next step would be for each of those resources and assets, to use the tool, where the tool can be used, to quantify the sustainability period of the resources. The tool cannot be used for determining sustainability of some items. And for those, the Emergency Management Committee will need to make reasonable assumptions and estimates to go into the process. The next step would be to populate your RA list into this chart here, to modify this as you decide, and to transfer the data that you get from the tool into this chart. You then use this chart to determine your gaps, and go back to the Emergency Management Committee to determine your mitigation strategies and any plan review. This chart here outlines some of the pre-planning activities that go into using the tool. When we say pre-planning, what we mean is the planning that you need to do to use the tool. And this is in the Excel spreadsheet in the tool document. Let's go to the next slide. The essential steps that were outlined in that chart deal with the information that you need to collect in order to use the tool. The first piece of data that you need is the average daily census for your facility. The next, you need to determine the essential list of resources and assets. You need then to calculate or determine your annual consumption rate for each resource. You need then also to do an actual inventory, or if you've got a process for determining that, to know your actual inventory for each RA on a given day. Your next step would be to calculate using the tool, or estimate using a process of reasonable assumptions to determine your sustainability period. And Chris and Shannon, jump in. I meant to say up front, please stop me with questions if I'm going through something too quickly. If there's something you want to discuss, inject on, please, anytime.
I just have a question that occurred to me, that an annual consumption rate, I think in some places and under some circumstances, it might be seasonally based. So is there a way to accommodate for that?
You would have to probably do a calculation based upon the season.
Okay.
Summer.
Summer versus winter. Okay.
Yeah, let me back up just a little bit to some of our concepts and assumptions. One is that we recommend that for completion of the deliverables, that the hospitals use the chart for their top HVA. The mitigation strategies that factor in are going to be dependent based on the event. It can be used as an all planning or all hazards planning tool. And for some things, it would remain consistent. But for many items, you know, depending on the event, depending on the season, your consumption rates are going to vary. Your mitigation strategies are going to vary. So we recommend that you address this from the perspective of the facility's top HVA. And also remember, the tool is not going to calculate for you, it's not going to quantify hours of sustainability for every resource and asset. There are some that you're going to have to talk through. You know, you're going to have to look back at exercises and experience, and you know, and make some guesses about it.
Within the tool, you could actually categorize, you know, fuel oil summer, fuel oil winter, and that would give you a reading on both.
And
Would
I
that-
think you'll see when we flip to the tool and do some examples, that where it says in their annual consumption rate or actual inventory, you could alter that to say, you know, seasonal consumption rate, and then if, you know, your inventory at that time would be a little bit different, and it'll give you those calculations to plan for, but that's one of those areas that the facility could personalize it for them.
We'll go through these slides quickly, but in terms of that data that we referenced that you'll need, the pre-planning to come use the tool. The first is the patient census, average daily census will be needed to use the tool. You know, how you get to that, if you use, facility uses annual census or whatever, that's the number you need to input into the tool. The list of critical or essential resources and assets, again, we recommend that a multidisciplinary type venue be used to determine what those resources and assets are.
It's not an easy task, actually.
Annual consumption rates, again, you know, there may be variations based on season, and the tool can be used to adapt for that. But knowing the annual consumption rate will be able to allow us to calculate an average consumption rate. And the other data that you'll need is an actual inventory for the items. So by knowing the actual inventory and the annual or the average consumption rate, we can then calculate the sustainability period in hours, and then also determine the sustainability gap. And then the decision process for hospitals. So you know how long things can last, you know what your gaps are, and now internal decisions will need to be made regarding the mitigation strategies that you have in place, ones that need to be considered, plan review, and again, you know, we recommend that this not be done, you know, just in the office of the emergency preparedness coordinator themselves. These considerations in terms of, you know, how can we make consumption adjustments, those things need to be considered with department heads, emergency management committee, etc.
If I can just go back once, I mean, all the pre-planning assumptions and the calculations are based on the census. That's the, you know, that ties consumption to a measurable number. It's not necessarily perfect, but it's something to work with.
Yeah, this is not an exact science. You know, it's not an exact prediction. The census takes into account, factors in for many things, consumption rate. So, you know, the more patients you have, the more visitors you have, the more staff you have. And if your resource and asset is one that's being consumed by visitors and staff as well as patients, that census information is assumed to take into account consumption by staff and visitors. Not exact though. You know, you can have some kind of shelter-in-place type of scenario where, say, bed linens. Bed linens typically just be used by patients, but if you've got shelter in place, you've got staff and visitors there, your census in that case probably wouldn't take into account your annual consumption rate. But again, that's where you gotta go back to reasonable assumptions, based on your HVA and, make those kinds of decisions.
Anthony?
Yeah.
So the census, I can appreciate the need to have that as a vital statistic. Does it matter what the breakout of the census is? If you have a PICU unit, if you have an ICU, if you have, you know, trauma patients, and versus say a community hospital where there's more sort of run-of-the-mill, does that matter? Or you're only looking at the individual assets consumed by that facility?
Good question. And you want to take into account all patients, inpatient, outpatient, emergency, surgery, pediatrics, and for instance, if you have a nursing home attached. The answer to that would be, how do you calculate your census data and how do you inventory? If your inventory is inclusive of the nursing home, and so your annual consumption rates and your average daily consumption rates are going to factor in the nursing home, then you want to include the nursing home census information. If,
Yeah, it doesn't break it out that way until you are in the response framework and you're talking about your mitigation strategies, if you're using more supplies for one population versus another, that's where the area, but when you see the calculations there, you can break out the categories of your patients in determining your census, but when you just look at like this page that we're seeing now and the consumption rates and the actual inventory, that's more of a total for your
Total
entire
patients,
patient
yeah.
population. And then when you go to, you know, your emergency management committee to talk through those mitigation strategies depending on the event, that's where I think some of those other numbers are.
Mike has a question?
I have two questions, Andrew, I'm sorry, and I think you're kind of talking about one of them now, and that is, does this approach come with any kind of worksheets to help the users develop these consumption rates? Because there's a lot of different assumptions and pieces of information funneling into this.
Yep.
Is that part of the either
I-
the chart or the tool, or?
I believe the answer is yes.
Okay.
When we get there, you decide whether it really,
Because we had, with respect to the evacuation decision support tool, came up with this issue of that we needed, or we thought that the end user could use something like that. We can do it, but at any rate.
Yes.
And the other question is this applicable to other domains? Nursing homes, ACFs? Because I mean, you're talking about hospitals and patients, but I mean, is there the potential, or is this already used in the field by other domains?
I mean, my sense is that it would be applicable to any domain because ultimately it's your
Yes.
average daily census regardless of what type of facility you are and the critical assets that you're determining for your facility and your usage of those, so I
Thank
think
you.
it would be applicable.
I think it's a definite benefit of the tool, actually.
Yep.
yeah, the presumptions here would still apply then. What we're looking at here is what's, well, let's go, can you go to tab A? Let's start there. And Chris, why don't you go to the next slide? Staying on average daily census for a moment. This doesn't show up very well here. Here's an example. And unfortunately here it's showing you the formula rather than numbers. But what we do is we provide you with a little chart for census information. We offer some categories there that you can change, as everything, modify based on what you have or how you determine your census. You can list things annual, on an annual basis, or simply by a daily basis, and get some calculations there. But the only item that really matters is your average daily census, which in the instructions, we tell you to populate in this purple cell. And once you populate that, it will carry that average daily census information forward into everything else that you do. So going more broad level, back to the tool for a moment. We break the tool down. Can you show one of the tabs again, one of the critical function tabs? We break the resources down, again, by critical function. Back in that chart, we showed you, we listed all of the resources and assets. We broke it down by critical function. And we do the same thing in the tool. And we've got tabs for each one of those there. There's no magic to how we populated these items by critical function. We did it the way it made most sense to us. Just a way to categorize and help you track, but you can populate it any way you want. You can add a tab, copy the data sheet onto another tab if you want to categorize resources in some other fashion. So we've populated, we've determined our list of resources and assets that are essential for emergency operations. Now we need to decide what of those resources and assets can we use this tool for in order to calculate the sustainability period. A general rule for deciding whether you can use this tool or not is a resource and asset going to be quantified? Is it something you consume? For items that's not the case, and I'll use, for instance, loss of elevator. You know, you can't use the tool to figure out how long you can sustain without your elevator. It's either working or it's not, okay? So that's where you go to the Emergency Management Committee and go through your process of making reasonable assumptions. The only thing we got on the second floor is administrative offices, so there's no impact on normal operations. You know, we'll make our decisions based on that assumption. Or without our elevator, you know, our normal operations would be impacted at a certain point, and we could do the following things to maintain under emergency operations for whatever period. What we've done is, back on the chart, the items that we listed for you pre-populated, the ones that are in bold, are ones that we think you can use the chart to calculate. And we've pre-populated those into the chart, or excuse me, into the tool. All right, so we've gone through this. In order to complete this tool, you'll need your average daily census, your resources and assets by units, your annual consumption, and your actual inventory. So, as described to you earlier, on the tool, in tab A, average daily census, we populate in here our average daily census information. And why don't you use your Albany Med data there, 597 is your average daily census, right? So we populate that in there, and then it will carry that information forward here throughout all of the tabs. And that will be used to help do these calculations that we'll walk through. So you've populated your RA into the most appropriate tab. Now what we need to do is enter your annual consumption data for each resource and asset into the annual consumption column C. So we're going to use the example down here of N95 respirators. The units have been defined as a box of 20. You can define your resource and asset by any unit that you want. And the calculations will be done based on that unit. So whatever unit you want to use, you use. So, Shannon says that their annual consumption is 3,500 boxes of those. So she's gonna populate that into there, and once she hits enter, the average consumption rate will be calculated for you. Average consumption rate is 10 boxes of those a day. The next step is, all right, well, we did that to populate that in D. Next slide there. All right, so now we've got to take our actual inventory data. And the actual inventory for those N95s, when did you do that? You counted those yesterday?
Sure.
Our,
Good, Scott, do
I
that.
went back after the Yankee game.
our actual inventory at Albany Med yesterday was 320 boxes of those. So we put that in there, and it'll calculate for you the inventory sustainability period in hours. And they can hold out for 801 hours with those N95 masks. So if
Not if
anybody needs some, they
CBPH
got
shows
them
up
to
with their
share.
truck.
Can you change that, like, rather than the numbers per day, can you change it like numbers per procedure or things like a different kind of type of consumption?
Per procedure.
You know,
Well, in this tool, no. This is all that kind of overview that I outlined of the data. Everything's predicated on those specific pieces of data. So,
I don't think you, in a hospital, materials management wouldn't be capturing that data like that.
and you could know, like, if you do X number of procedures per day, then that could be your proxy for the number per day that you use.
I'd have to think that through. But taking that issue, say procedures, surgery, then you get into categories of resources and assets. And in another tab here somewhere, we have clinical. So you've got surgical supplies. Now, we've just listed that as a broad category, surgical supplies. But, my guess is that a hospital would want to itemize the resources needed for surgery. And that may very well be based on procedure. So,
And if you can come up with your consumption, like if you were looking at your surgical supplies, you could, have an annual consumption rate of those, if you had it, whether you're looking at your labs or your ED, or if you want to populate it that way, and you can quantify those, then you can
I would think if you're going down to a 96-hour sustainability situation, you're gonna cancel a lot of your elective surgeries and things
well,
like that.
that
so
gets
that's,
into the,
That's
yeah.
another kind of an assumption.
But if you want to create a tab that is related to a procedure, special needs population, anything like that, you can certainly focus on that using this tool to make those calculations. All right, so we have calculated our sustainability period, 801 hours. What are we going to do next?
Did you want another example of that, or not?
No, I think that's, I'm just not sure what our next slide is. All right, using this tool in response. Everything that we have been talking about is based on planning. Completing the deliverable, but you can use this chart, or this tool, and the chart during response as well. The differences are that instead of average daily census, you're going to use current census. And instead of annual consumption rates, you're going to use current inventory, actual inventory by units right now. And for that, we've got this broken down here by time period, 0 to 2 hours, 2 to 12, and so on. You can change that, but there's no magic to those headings if you want to break that down further. But what we'll need to do here is plug in Albany Med's current census, which right now is 608. So we're going back here to the average daily census tab, but instead of using this purple area up here for average daily census, we're going to come down here to the yellow actual event census information. And in the 0 to 2 hour period, we put in the census. Again, you can break this down any way you want, delete, or don't use the categories, just go to the total. That's all that matters, really, right there is that yellow box. And then that's going to carry forward back into our tab under cell H here, or column H, under current census. Now we need to put in our current inventory of N95s, which right now on hand, they have 320. So once we do that, it will calculate for us our estimated consumption rate hourly, or excuse me, not hourly. You scroll up there. Daily. Yeah. So based on census and current inventory, we're going to use 10 a day. So our sustainability period in hours.
In an hour.
It's 0 to 2 hours.
Hours, yes, I'm sorry, thank you. Consumption rate in hours. And the sustainability period is 786 hours. You can continue to do that, I don't think we need to show you, but you can continue then to go back and say, well, you know, we've started to push patients out, our census is lowered, our census now is 50 patients lower. Here's our actual inventory at this point. Here's what our sustainability estimates are. And you can carry that forward all the way through.
Could you go back to the tab that calculates or shows average census and, okay, my question was, is there an ED, emergency department? There is.
And again, there's no science to that. Name it whatever you want, add categories, subtract categories. It doesn't change the math.
No, I was just thinking that, you know, depending on the nature of the incident you're talking about, in an actual event, that the emergency department census might meaningfully drive up the consumption rate of that asset, whatever it is. And are we contending with that? But I guess the answer is yes, we are. If it was an actual incident, that number might spike a bit.
Yes and no. That's a good example, all right? You know, mass casualty incident, ED census goes way up. So your census goes up, that factors into your consumption rates. It does not take into account, though, you know, the formula, the math does not say, well, because it's ED for mass casualty, you will be using more of these resources,
Right.
but not those.
Right.
The math is the same. Okay, so again, it's not a science, not an exact science, okay? It's a best estimate for planning. And you can take that information and then use your reasonable assumptions, you know, what you know for planning purposes for that HVA, and say, well, you know, I know the tool said we're gonna need X head bandages, but, yeah.
Also, in a response, you don't, you know, when you use this in a response, you can eliminate anything that isn't one of those critical resources for that event.
Okay.
So that you don't have to enter calculations for all of those things. If you're using it specific to a certain event and there are certain critical supplies you want to look at, you can delete those other pieces, so you're only looking at what's relevant to you.
Yeah, obviously, you're just gonna be focused on those critical items.
Is there anything in the tool or in your work to date, whether it's in this tool or not, that gives you like minimums and maximums? In other words, to say, we use MCI as an example, that our usual average census, daily census is X, and that's distributed through the house, however it's distributed through the house. And the consumption is consequently distributed through the house. But there's a circumstance where that might exponentially grow or for whatever reason, so that when you're looking at that, you already kind of have that sense of tailoring to an incident. Do any of the tools accommodate for that?
From my
Minimum
perspective,
consumption or baseline consumption versus, wow, incident-related consumption, so that over 96 hours, that the picture looks very different.
I think that's a really facility-specific piece though, so I
Yeah,
don't
it's
think
part
we
of the
encounter that, but you know, as
mitigation.
hospitals work through it, depending on what their services are, what their critical resources are, and what their HVA, you know, tells them are their highest risks in those scenarios they're working through, they may encounter that, but I'm not sure we'll find that as broad-based.
Could you adjust like the annual consumption rate for that item based upon what you see as a spike in
What you
the,
would do.
is that,
Yeah.
okay.
That's
The
what you would do.
yellow tabs, when you look at the resources, there's a spot to indicate if you're adjusting the consumption rate.
Change your burn rate and then you got it.
Those are some discussions that would go on, you know, with the multidisciplinary
Right,
team and
right,
some
right.
reasonable assumptions.
Right, they get a sense of, okay, this is what this is the what the tool gives us, but what we really think is, you know,
Right.
that based on what we have a sense of this incident or circumstance, that we need to allow for twice that.
All right, so this chart here is just a visualization of a tab that we got in the tool that kind of outlines a framework here for some response activities, just kind of an FYI thing in there. I'm going to stop here for a moment before we go to the chart. Discussion. Yeah.
The time frames that you have here, actual event time frame 0 to 2 hours, 2 to 12 hours, that's the, of the incident, is that correct?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
each facility might alter that based on how they set up their operational
Yeah.
periods for their incident command structure. If they say 0 to 3 hours, you know, whatever, however you set those up.
So when you get to the second time frame, whatever the frame is, if your incident is still evolving and still increasing, then your census is gonna be higher. We think they need to be balanced by discharge, I don't know, this depends on how long.
Or your consumption of resources
Right.
is higher and your census is the same, depending on what the event is.
Well, I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at, though. If the point that you're entering is your census, if that's what's driving the numbers that you derive after that, if your
Well, you
census
change
is
to
lower,
that tab A, you
Census
change
and
your
burn
census here.
right?
So, if your census is lower, you still be able to calculate that moving forward on the tab. This would be populated with your current census during the 2 to 12 hour period.
Correct.
And your inventory of those, of whatever that critical resource is, whether it's lower or the same or higher, whatever you can use.
Okay,
and we'll
okay, I
calculate
got you,
that.
never mind, I wasn't predicting that, okay, thank you. I got it.
Shan, will you scroll down a little bit to the instructions here? Couple important things in using this. The white cells are where you input your information. The blue cells are what's being calculated for you, and you describe that in the instructions. Everything in this tool can be modified, it can be adapted, it can be changed. Resources and assets, the time frames up there during response. The only thing that can't be changed are, the blue boxes, they're formula-based. So those you gotta leave alone. But how it's structured, listed column-wise and all that, you can adapt it any way you want, same with the tabs. The purple headings, both in the census tab and the critical function tabs, are for planning, the yellow tabs are for response. It's important that when using the tool, that you have some proficiency in Excel, because these formulas are here, and I can tell you from experience, it's time-consuming and frustrating when you do clear contents instead of delete, and you lose the formulas, and Shannon calls you on Friday afternoon and says, your tool doesn't have any formulas. So,
So you might want to stress that when you're teaching the hospitals, that the blue cells, it's right there in the instructions, you know, are not for data to be entered.
yeah, and on every tab, we hear these instructions. Our intent here is, with the instructions that are on here, that you could take this tool and this chart and figure it out without somebody telling you. That would be my hope, is that, you know, all of this is clear enough in the instructions carried forward that you could do that. But if you add rows, you know, you've got to do so in a way where it's copying the formulas, and that's just kind of basic Excel proficiency, I guess. If you find that you don't have the formula in a row or a cell, they can easily be copied over. So just have somebody, you know, suggest that they work with somebody who knows Excel.
And I also, when I teach a little bit of stuff in Excel, nothing quite this complicated, but I always say to have an original on your desktop in a file that's labeled original whatever it is, and never to use it.
Thank you.
To open it,
Yeah.
to save it in, you know, Blizzard 2012, and that's the one you work with. So if you make a catastrophic mistake, you can always go back and start.
Unfortunately, I did that, so, you know,
We've all
I went to
done
the,
it,
you
we've
know,
all
Excel
done it.
gurus at Amy's and asked them, and the first thing the guy said to me, kind of a nerdy fellow, he said, there are disadvantages to non-Excel users using Excel. Very little tolerance for anybody that would go ahead and delete a formula. And I said, but it happens, right? He's like, well, it shouldn't.
I mean, it could happen even by accident.
But we were talking about, isn't there a way to lock
That's
some?
what I was asking him, and he was suggesting that there really isn't.
You know, I'm gonna find out about it.
we talked about, you know, going into some Excel-based instructions, and, you know, I guess the conclusion is, I'm sure the emergency preparedness coordinator can find somebody who, you know,
Patrick says it
is proficient in Excel. You know, we weren't gonna try to get into teaching Excel.
Well, we do have some
He
folks
said
saying
you
you
can
can lock
do
the cell,
it.
so
Yeah, I think you
so we're gonna do
can.
that. Let's do
I don't know
that.
how to do it, but I'm almost positive you can.
We'll eliminate that as a possibility.
Well, you know, that might be something
I'll look
before
into
we
it.
send this out that we could.
I got someone I can ask.
All right, any other discussion? Yeah.
On your calculation, I might have missed something, and I wasn't gonna ask, because I assumed I missed something, but on your calculation on the N95s, you have 320 on hand, you use 10 an hour. You said you're sustainable for 768 hours, to me, it's just 32 hours worth. Where is the factor in that?
Those are boxes of 20.
Oh, box of 20, okay.
Yeah,
That-
320.
that's-
All right, so
I was
there's,
thinking 320 masks.
that's your unit definition. And your unit definition carries through all the way.
Okay.
Anybody has no idea what we're doing on, you know, we wouldn't be able to do this. Before we leave this though, for carrying over into the chart, that N95 example probably is not gonna be of great use to us because we're sustainable for, I don't know, what is that, months? But we did another calculations on another example, which we won't actually plug in, but bulk oxygen. Their inventory sustainability period for bulk oxygen calculates for planning to 51 hours. Okay. So if we input that data, we get inventory sustainability, bulk oxygen 51. So we're gonna use that example of bulk oxygen 51 hours as we carry forward now into the chart. This chart is really what the tool will provide you information to use in the chart. The chart, however, is probably, the essence of providing a framework for your planning and decision-making. We're going to use the data from the tool to populate the chart. And for resources and assets that we couldn't use the tool to calculate, we're going to use our reasonable assumptions to populate the chart. So, the first thing that we'll do, go back, yeah. We populated our list of resources and assets. We've done